This is reminding me heavily of. Have you guys ever heard of the Tamam Shud case?
Bless you.
Tamam Shud. This is possibly one of the fucking coolest things that I have read about, and it's unfortunate. It's about a dead man.
Are they always?
But the intrigue.
No offense.
No, absolutely.
Oh, okay.
Tammy, this is we're trying to get to the bottom of this. I'm helping you out with this one.
Thank you.
So the Tamam Shud case, or the mystery of the Sommerset man, and I'm going to be reading heavily from the Wikipedia article, which sounds a little bit cheap, but I did an extensive bit of research on this, and this is one of the most concise and like paced articles that like describes this thing.
Did you say mystery of Summerland man?
Somerton, Somerton.
Somerton man.
Somerton man, because he was found on December 1st, 1948, on Somerton Beach in Glenlegg, just south of Adelaide, South Australia.
Oh, mate.
The Tamam Shud, the reference to that comes from the Persian phrase, which was printed on a scrap of paper found months later in the pocket of the man's trousers. The scrap had been torn from the final page of a copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, authored by 12th century poet Omar Khayyam. Following the public appeal, someone actually came out and was able to locate a copy of this relatively rare book that had a piece of this paper torn out of it. And on the back cover, they were able to start doing some sleuthing and found some indentations, and it led down this sort of rabbit hole. It's one of the most mysterious, I guess, cold cases in Australia's history, and kind of goes in several different directions that you're not expecting. So, 1948, 6:30 a.m., the police were contacted about a man dead on Somerton Beach. He was found lying in the sand across from an orphanage, and a couple of people said that they saw him lying with his back resting against a seawall, his legs extended in front of him, and
just
his feet crossed.
Yeah.
It was believed that he died while sleeping. An unlit cigarette was on the right collar of his coat, so if you imagine like he was just like that. Mm-hmm. A search of his pockets revealed an unused second-class rail ticket from Adelaide to Henley Beach, a bus ticket from that city that could not be proved to have been used, a narrow aluminum American comb, half a packet of Juicy Fruit chewing gum, an Army Club cigarette packet containing 7 different cigarettes of different brands, and a quarter full box of Bryant and May matches. They basically said they thought maybe he was a drunk man who fell asleep on the beach, but they realized that something was wrong because apparently the mosquitoes are insane on that beach, and he was getting destroyed by them, and they figured that there's no way that guy is alive. He's being like swarmed.
Well, would they go after dead animals as well? Like,
I don't know how that works.
If the blood isn't being pumped,
I guess it was freshly dead. You know,
Yeah,
if
that's
it's still
true.
at the surface. Hell, I'm sure. But after they end up looking like grapes on him because they're just enjoying being there.
Pathologist John Burton Cleland said the man was of Britisher appearance and thought to be of age around 40 to 45.
We all know what he means by that, too. You can see it. You're like, oh, yeah, totally.
He was in top physical condition, 180 centimeters, which is about 5'11", tall, with gray eyes and fair to ginger-colored hair. Slightly gray around the temples, broad shoulders, narrow waist, and hands and nails that showed no signs of manual labor. Big and little toes that met in a wedge shape like those of a dancer or someone who wore boots with pointed toes.
Okay, now
Pronounced
it's getting specific.
pronounced high calf muscles like those of a ballet dancer. These can be dormant genetic traits, but they are also characteristics of many long-distance runners and various athletes.
They're impressed by this guy.
Right? I was going to say, he kind of sounds hot.
Deep
like,
blue eyes that you get lost in for hours
and
at
just
a time.
Runner's
Crystalline.
calves that you could just like grate cheese onto your
Soft,
salad.
supple skin that you just want to fall asleep on.
All labels on the clothes had been removed, and he had no hat, which was apparently unusual for 1948. Or a
That was
wallet.
like the headline, Hatless Corpse Found.
Shock horror. The body was clean-shaven, carried no identification, which led police to believe he had committed suicide. His teeth did not match the dental records of any living known person that they had access to. And the coroner, Cleland, remarked that if the body had been carried to its final resting place, then all difficulties would disappear. Which, I guess from his end, the investigation, he'd be able to explain it if he could say that it was carried there, but it didn't appear that. The autopsy was conducted, and the pathologist estimated the time of death around 2 a.m. on December 1st. There was blood mixed with the food in the stomach, both the kidneys were congested, and the liver contained a great excess of blood in the vessels. The spleen was strikingly large, about 3 times the normal size, and there was a destruction in the center of the liver. Autopsy shown that his last meal was a pasty eaten 3 to 4 hours before his death, and they couldn't conclude that the pasty contained anything that would have caused this.
However, his suicide note said, "I should have eaten the fish."
Pasty too heavy for death on beach.
Hashtag too pasty, too heavy for
life. Pathologist Dwyer concluded, "I am quite convinced the death could not have been natural. The poison I suggested was a barbiturate or a soluble hypnotic. Although poisoning was remained as prime suspicion, the pasty was not to believe to be the source of the poison. Other than that, the coroner was unable to reach a conclusion as to the man's identity or cause of death, or whether the man seen alive at Somerset Beach on the evening of November 30th was the same man that people had seen earlier. People talked about seeing a man jogging, essentially a smartly dressed man jogging on the beach."
Fashion was everything back then.
Oh, yeah.
It's like
Man
number
doesn't
one,
have a hat on.
Yeah, this guy doesn't have a hat. Number 2, manhunt underway for man with 2 hats. It's like, that's the next headline, the logical conclusion. A guy just runs home, sirens blaring. He like closes the front door, looks at his wife and goes, "Burn my hats, all of them."
January, so about a month later, the staff of the Adelaide rail station discovered a brown suitcase with its label removed, which had been checked into the station cloakroom the morning before the man was found.
So someone's also removing labels from clothing.
It's interesting.
Really into it, too.
In the case were a red checked dressing gown, a size 7 red felt pair of slippers, 4 pairs of underpants, pajamas, shaving items, a light brown pair of trousers with sand in the cuffs, an electrician's screwdriver, a table knife cut down into a sharp instrument, a pair of scissors with sharpened points, a stenciling brush used by third officers on merchant ships for stenciling cargo. Also in the suitcase was a thread card of Barber brand orange waxed thread of an unusual type not found in Australia. It was the same type that was used to repair the lining of the pockets in the trousers that the dead man was wearing. So that's how they were able to identify that this stuff was his stuff. Okay. All the identification marks on the clothes had been removed. The police found the name T. Keane on a tie, Keane on a laundry bag, and Keane without the last E on a signet, along with 3 dry cleaning marks. Police believe that whoever removed the clothing tags specifically left the Keane tags on the clothing, knowing that the Keane was not the dead man's name. With wartime rationing still enforced, clothing was difficult to acquire at the time, and although it was common practice to put name tags on your stuff, it was also common when buying secondhand clothing to remove the tags. There was no T. Keane missing in any English-speaking country, and a nationwide circulation of the dry cleaning marks also proved to be fruitless. Police checked train records. They speculated that the man got to the port of Augusta, showered and shaved around 10:50 a.m. Then he purchased a ticket to Henley Beach for whatever reason he didn't use. He immediately checked the suitcase in at the station cloakroom before leaving the station and catching a city bus to Glenlegg. Upon a re-examination, John Burton Cleland noted that the man's shoes were remarkably clean and appeared to have been polished, rather than being in a state expected of a man who had been wandering the beach of Glenlegg all day.
They are impressed by this dude, man.
He added that evidence.
He had high calves.
He was a perfect Adonis, only
so
dead.
Sharp dressed. He added evidence that fitted in with the theory that the body might have been brought to Somerset Beach after the man's death, accounting for the lack of evidence of vomiting and convulsions, which would be the 2 main effects of the poison theory. That there's no evidence of him seizing and passing out or whatever from a poison.
Well, also they found beach sand, right, in one of his suitcases.
They found sand in the cuffs.
Sand,
of
so
one
it could
of
have
the
been. They probably didn't have DNA testing to find out what sand it was.
Right. Yeah, I don't know what the sand detection was like in 1948. Cedric Stanton Hicks, a professor of physiology and pharmacology at the University of Adelaide, tested that a group of drug variants that he called number 1 and in particular number 2 were extremely toxic and relatively small oral doses, and that it would be difficult, if not impossible, to identify it if it had been given to a suspect. The names were not released to the public as, at the time, they were, quote, quite easily procurable by the ordinary individual from a chemist without the need for a reason. The drugs were later publicly identified as Digitalis and Ouabain.
Ouabain.
Ouabain. Ouabain. So basically, they couldn't, from investigating the body or the stuff that they found, conclude who the fuck this guy was, or what killed him, or how he ended up in this like perfectly polished position, very clean, sitting in this rock outcropping. So around the same time as they were doing the reinvestigation, they found the printed piece of paper with Tamam Shud printed on it. Public library officials were called in to identify it. They say that it means ended or finished.
Well, seems
Found
right.
on the last page of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. The other side of the paper was blank. Police conducted an Australia-wide search to find a copy of the book that had a similar piece torn out. A photograph of the scrap of paper was released to the press. A man named who ended up going by the pseudonym Ronald Francis, who didn't want to be identified, basically came out and said that he knew where the book was, or he had this book that they removed the piece of paper from, basically. And it was like, oh, well, how do we know? So they were able to actually do like microscopic check and make sure that like the tear is matched up, and it was like from the same fiber of the paper or whatever. So it was true.
Was it always missing, or did he open up one day and said, "Hey, where's my Tamam Shud?"
I don't know. I don't know that he still had the book.
Well, that's what I meant. But I mean, by the scrap was it? Did he buy the book? It was like, damn, this book has no Tamam Shud.
I don't know.
One day he's like, my Tamam Shud's gone.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and I don't think it was like the last piece. It was just like a word in this book. It was ripped out.
Okay.
The man reached out, said he found the book that matches the thing. The cops show up, and then on the back of the book, they find that there are like indentions from somebody writing something on the back of the book. A telephone number, an unidentified number, and a text that resembled an encrypted message. So the encryption is basically gibberish. It's
that's all. That always works.
Yeah, it's just, but it is English character, I guess Latin characters, right? It is WRGOABAD. So interestingly,
why did you pick those particular?
That's the top because that's the top of the encryption.
That's what it says.
WRGOABABD.
I thought you were just picking out random ones to say what the alphabet is.
Yeah, those are alphabets.
Those are my favorite letters.
The second line had been struck out, which was considered significant because then it's repeated essentially on the fourth line. So they think that's how you can that's the key, is something got messed up in that second line that he struck out and then had to like rewrite it.
Nice.
So they've had several code breakers. Code experts were called in to decipher. Everything's been unsuccessful. An unlisted telephone number was also in the back of the book, belonging to a nurse named Jessica Ellen Joe Thomas, who was born in 1921, died in 2007. Born Jessie Harkness in the Sydney suburb of Merrickville.
So this all relates to actual people?
Yes. She lived in Moseley, Glenelg, about 400 meters north of where the body was found. So they find this book. They find a telephone number on the back of the book. Telephone number refers to a woman who lives 1,300 feet north of where the body was found. When she was interviewed by police, Thompson said she did not know the dead man. She said she didn't know why the dead man would have her phone number and chose to visit her on the suburb on the night of his death. However, she also reported that sometime in late 1948, an unidentified man had attempted to visit her and asked a next-door neighbor about her. In his book about the case, Gary Feltus says that he interviewed Thompson. He found that she was either being evasive or that she just didn't want to talk about it. Oh. Feltus believed Thompson knew Somerton man's identity. Thompson's daughter, Kate, in a television interview on 60 Minutes, also said that she believed her mother knew the dead man. In 1949, Jessica Thomas requested the police not keep a permanent record of her name or release details to third parties, as it would be embarrassing and harmful to her reputation to be linked. The police agreed, a decision that hampered later investigations. They made a plaster cast of his face because the
he was just so damn hot.
He was so handsome.
It was so hot. We had to keep this for posterity.
When she was shown the plaster bust of the dead man by Detective Sergeant Lean Thompson, she said she could not identify the person depicted. According to Lean, he described her reaction upon seeing the cast as completely taken aback to the point of giving the appearance that she was about to faint.
Whoa.
In an interview many years later, Paul Lawson, the technician who made the cast and was present when Thompson viewed it, noted after looking at the bust, she immediately looked away and would not look back.
Really? So it looked just like him?
There's no way she didn't know.
She goes in and she's like, I don't know who this is. And then they show her like, oh, you don't know who this is? And
she's shocked.
Looks away and just like won't look back. Thompson said that while she was working in the Royal North Shore Hospital in Sydney during World War II, she owned a copy of the Rubaiyat, that book. Oh. In 1945, at the Clifton Gardens Hotel, she had given it to an Army lieutenant named Alf Boxall, who was serving at the time in the water transport section of the Royal Australian Engineers. Thompson told police that after the war ended, she moved to Melbourne and married, and she said that she had received a letter from Boxall, and she replied telling him that she was now married and not interested. There's no evidence that Boxall had any contact with Harkness after 1945. So they're saying that maybe she made this up, the story of her dealing with this guy. So they find this guy, Alf Boxall. He's working at a bus depot somewhere else in Australia. And he had a copy of the book that she had signed and like written out a verse of. This is the verse that she highlighted. Indeed, indeed, repentance oft before. I swore, but I was sober when I swore. And then came spring, and rose in hand, my threadbare penitence a pieces tore. So there's this weird
tore piece.
There's weird
sober, right?
Symbolism and stuff going on. There is speculation that Alf Boxall was a spy for the Australian intelligence or the British intelligence during World War II. They, in fact, asked him during an interview, Mr. Boxall, you had been working, hadn't you, in an intelligence unit before you met this young woman, Jessica Harkness. Did you talk to her at all about that? And Boxall says no. And when asked if Harkness could have known something about it, he replies, not unless somebody told her. So he agrees that he was in it, but that he hadn't told anyone about this. When Littlemore suggested the interview that there could have been espionage connected to the Somerton man, Boxall replies, that's quite a melodramatic thesis, isn't it? This is a bus depot mechanic guy who is now just for some reason hanging out in this weird city in Australia. His copy of the book that had the page torn out, it wasn't the same one that had the page torn out, but it was his copy of this same book that this dead man has a scrap of in his pocket that they find 1,300 feet from this woman who says she doesn't know anything about any of it.
So it's this microcosm of strange.
Right.
It's a love triangle that the bitch won't admit to. No offense to bitches. You know, I mean, it's all just seems to point towards that, kind of.
Yeah, kind of, but I mean,
but like, how would any of these normal people have killed any of them with this like untraceable
it was
poison?
Easy to find, and the one guy was deep military.
He did know. Yeah, that's true.
You know, that's where they probably teach you how to do that shit. You're very welcome. Case solved.
So even years after they buried the man, flowers began appearing on the grave. They questioned a woman who was seen leaving the cemetery. She claimed to know nothing about him. One of the railway workers came out with a story where they had seen a strange man visiting the Somerton man in his train car, and he was English-speaking and only carrying a small black case, not unlike one a musician or a doctor might carry.
Interesting.
This story was covered several times. In fact, recently on like 60 Minutes, and they had like a little mini documentary on it, and it's all extremely interesting, and it's difficult to go into like all the different nuance of who these people were and what connection they end up having to the Somerton man. But suffice it to say that you should look it up because, again, it was going to be difficult to jam it into this amount of time. But dead guy, scrap of paper in his pocket that says ended, 1,300 feet from a woman's house who has her telephone number written on the back of a book that piece of paper was removed from. So yeah, and then we've got some random bus mechanic somewhere who has the similar copy of the book and has very clinical Australian salty answers for what was going on during that time. Attempts to use modern DNA to identify him have kind of failed because they used formaldehyde to embalm him, so it's kind of screwed a lot of stuff up. But they were able to salvage hair follicles from the plaster bust that they had created that had been pulled out of his skin.
Yeah, his death mask.
Right. So
hot death mask.
So hot.
They hope that at some point, if they're able to, cross-reference the DNA with someone, they can find out who it is. There's different reports as to who it might be. Several people have come forward and said it's my dad or my son or whatever.
But it's going to be a long-ranging Australian mystery.
Yeah, it's definitely something that is extremely winding and strange.
So what's your story? I mean, does any of that ring a bell?
Is
you
there
have
some
no
chick
answers.
around here and some?